Your brain is hiding things from you right now, not because something is wrong with it, because that is exactly what it was designed to do. Psilocybin has been used for thousands of years. Ancient Aztec priests used it, indigenous healers in Mexico used it, hippies in the 60s used it, and now neuroscientists are studying it in clinical trials. What is wild is that all of them, across every century and culture, keep arriving at the same conclusion. This substance does not put something foreign into your mind. It takes something away. Something your brain has been quietly running in the background your whole life. A filter. In 2024, a paper published in Nature measured the brain activity of people given psilocybin versus people given Ritalin, a stimulant that actually does amp the brain up. Psilocybin produced more than 3 times the functional connectivity change. 3 times. And those changes were not linked to stimulation or excitement. They were linked to ego dissolution and emotional insight. People reported feeling like they were accessing something deeper, something more real than real. And they said this lying flat in a hospital bed with eye shades on, listening to music. Not in a forest, not on a mountaintop, in a clinical room. Cognitive science has a framework for this. It is called predictive processing. Your brain does not work like a camera. It does not passively record what is out there. It makes predictions, constantly. Higher regions of the brain are always guessing what lower regions should be sensing. Then the brain only pays attention to the gaps, the moments where reality does not match the prediction. Everything else gets filtered out. Think about this. Right now, you are not consciously feeling your clothes on your skin. You're not noticing the hum of a refrigerator or the sound of your own breathing. Your brain predicted all of that, filed it as irrelevant, and cut it from your awareness. What you experience as reality is not raw input. It is a heavily edited highlight reel, a negotiated version of the world, optimized for survival, not for truth. So when researchers say psilocybin disrupts normal network integrity in the brain, what they mean is it loosens that editing process. The default mode network, or DMN, is a cluster of brain regions tied to self-referential thinking. Your sense of who you are, your internal monologue, your life story. Under normal conditions, it runs almost constantly, anchoring your sense of self and keeping your perception tightly organized. Psilocybin weakens the connectivity within that network, particularly the links between the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex. When those links loosen, the story you tell yourself about who you are starts to blur. People describe it as ego loss. Not confusion, not chaos, something closer to relief. What does not get discussed enough is that this is not a modern discovery. 16th century chronicler Bernardino de Sahagún documented Aztec use of what they called teonanacatl, which translates to flesh of the gods. Priests and healers used these mushrooms in ceremonies to gain insight, to find hidden causes of illness, to access information that ordinary waking consciousness simply could not reach. These were not recreational sessions. They were considered a form of knowledge technology. The mushrooms were sacred, taboo, often restricted to specialists. Spanish missionaries who witnessed these ceremonies wrote about intense emotional reactions, weeping, laughter, fear, all interpreted as contact with a more fundamental layer of reality. Aztec healers in Mexico continued this tradition well into the 20th century, long before any Western researcher had heard of psilocybin. Their nighttime ceremonies, called veladas, used the mushrooms to uncover hidden truths about illness, spiritual imbalance, or betrayal. The setting was controlled. Chanting, ritual, structure, not chaos, intentional guidance through the open state. What is striking is that the logic of those ceremonies maps almost perfectly onto what modern clinical researchers emphasize today. Set and setting, intention, integration. The Aztec were not doing this by accident. They had figured something out. The philosopher William James wrote more than a century ago about the idea that the brain might act as a filter, restricting a much broader field of mental content down to a manageable stream. He was not speaking specifically about mushrooms. He was speaking about consciousness itself. Aldous Huxley picked this up decades later and called it the reducing valve theory. His argument was that the brain's primary job is not to generate all possible experience, it is to eliminate most of it. In his framing, individual human consciousness is a narrow trickle from a much larger source. He called it mind at large. Psychedelics, in his view, temporarily open that valve. Huxley also made a point that most people miss. He connected this to childhood. Young children might start with a more visionary, open form of awareness that gradually gets narrowed down as the brain matures and social pressures shape what is useful to perceive. Efficiency wins over openness. What we call growing up might partly be the process of tightening the filter. Some researchers have started describing psilocybin's effects using the language of critical periods borrowed from developmental neuroscience. In early childhood, the brain passes through specific windows where it is exceptionally open to learning language, forming emotional attachments, and developing visual processing. After those windows close, the same changes require far more effort. Psilocybin appears to reopen something similar in adults, a temporary state of heightened responsiveness where experience is more formative than usual. That is not a small claim. It suggests this substance is not just a treatment for symptoms. It may be a tool for accelerating psychological development in ways the adult brain normally resists. Modern neuroscience now has language for what Huxley could only describe philosophically. The entropic brain hypothesis proposes that psychedelics reduce the precision of high-level priors, which is a technical way of saying they weaken how strongly the brain's predictions override incoming data. Brain activity becomes more variable, more entropic. This system loosens. And in that loosened state, things that were being confidently filtered out start to come through. Not manufactured hallucinations. Actual information the brain had been deciding you did not need to consciously process. Psilocybin is metabolized in the body into psilocin, which acts primarily on serotonin 5-HT2A receptors. These receptors are densely concentrated in higher-order cortical regions, the regions responsible for organizing perception and self-processing. When those receptors are activated, normal patterns of hierarchical signaling get disrupted. The top-down predictions that structure your experience lose their grip. At the same time, global connectivity increases. Brain networks that usually stay segregated start communicating. Sensory regions talk to emotional regions. Memory systems interact with conceptual networks. Thalamus to cortex pathways become more active. The brain does not simply turn up, it reorganizes. There is also a biological reason the effects do not simply vanish when the psilocin clears the bloodstream. After a session, researchers have measured significant increases in brain-derived neurotrophic factor, commonly called BDNF. Think of BDNF as fertilizer for neural connections. It promotes the growth of new synapses and strengthens existing pathways that have been underused. What this suggests is that psilocybin does not only disrupt the old architecture during the session, it opens a window of neuroplasticity afterward, a period where the brain is physically more capable of forming new patterns. The session loosens the structure, the windows where the restructuring actually happens. This is also why researchers emphasize that what a person does in the days and weeks following a session matters enormously. The brain is temporarily more moldable. What you put into that state gets encoded more deeply than it normally would. Studies have documented increased thalamocortical connectivity under psilocybin, which may explain why ordinary stimuli suddenly feel saturated with meaning. Music sounds different, not louder, deeper. People describe simple visuals carrying emotional weight they never had before. Functional connectivity changes between visual cortex and the amygdala have been observed, which would explain why what you are seeing can suddenly feel personally meaningful, even symbolic. The brain is not adding content, it is removing the partition that usually keeps these systems from talking to each other. People in sessions frequently describe sudden connections. A childhood memory links to a current behavior. An abstract insight about life crystallizes from nowhere. These are not new ideas being uploaded from some external source. They are existing pieces of information the brain has stored, now being allowed to recombine in patterns that were previously blocked. That is a critical point. Psilocybin enables more of the brain to talk to itself. The insights feel new because they are new connections. But the raw material was always there. Meditation practitioners and people who have had near-death experiences often describe something that sounds remarkably similar to what psilocybin produces. Long-term meditators show decreased DMN activity during deep practice. Near-death accounts frequently include reports of ego dissolution, expanded awareness, and a sense of accessing something more fundamental than ordinary consciousness. The mechanism differs. The phenomenology converges. What psilocybin compresses into a few hours, meditation can approach through years of consistent practice. What a near-death experience forces in seconds, a guided session creates in a controlled, supported environment. The brain apparently has multiple pathways to the same loosened state. Psilocybin is one of the more direct ones. The 1960s counterculture got some things right, even if the framing was messy. Language like expanding consciousness, ego death, and oneness with the universe sounded like mysticism to mainstream science at the time. Now those phrases have neural correlates. DMN disruption maps onto ego loss. Increased global connectivity maps onto the feeling of dissolving boundaries between self and world. Timothy Leary and others emphasize subjective experience without the tools to explain it mechanically. What modern neuroscience did was add the mechanism to the map. The territory had already been described. The 1960s also showed what happens without structure. Without guidance, intention, or integration, the same open state that produces profound insight can produce panic. Adverse reactions. Confusion that does not resolve. The filter does not just let in the beautiful parts. It lets in whatever the brain has been keeping out. That is why every tradition that has worked with these substances, from Aztec priests to Mazatec healers to Johns Hopkins researchers, treats the container as seriously as the substance itself. The decades of prohibition cost something real. Research on psilocybin was effectively shut down between the early 1970s and the mid-1990s. Not because the early evidence was unconvincing, because the cultural and political climate made continued study impossible. The scheduling of psilocybin as a Schedule I substance in the United States halted a line of scientific inquiry that had already shown significant promise. A generation of potential research simply did not happen. Patients who might have benefited instead spent decades on treatments with lower efficacy and significant side effects. When modern trials began publishing results in the 2000s and 2010s, researchers were not discovering something new. They were rediscovering something that had been interrupted. That history is worth sitting with because it raises an uncomfortable question about how society manages the filter. There is an argument that cultures, institutions, and legal systems function partly as collective filters. They determine which states of consciousness are acceptable, which are dangerous, which are productive, and which are threatening. A substance that weakens the brain's predictive hierarchy might also weaken the social hierarchies built on top of it. Whether that is a reason to fear it or a reason to understand it more carefully is a question worth asking openly. Clinical trials have now produced numbers that are hard to ignore. At Johns Hopkins, psilocybin-assisted therapy for cancer patients facing end-of-life anxiety produced large, lasting reductions in both depression and anxiety. Many participants rated it among the most meaningful experiences of their entire lives. Open-label trials in treatment-resistant depression found that a single session produced symptom reductions that lasted months. A 2023 randomized trial published in JAMA reported that a single 25 milligram dose of psilocybin given with psychological support produced clinically significant improvements in depression without serious adverse events. What is particularly telling is how the researchers explain the mechanism of those improvements. Clinicians describe depression and certain addictions as rigid brain states, repetitive loops, overlearned patterns that keep firing even when they are causing damage. This also reframes how we think about obsessive compulsive disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and addiction more broadly. These are increasingly understood not just as chemical imbalances, but as problems of excessive rigidity. The brain gets locked into a groove. The same thoughts fire in the same sequence. The same emotional responses trigger automatically. Psilocybin does not target those loops directly. It creates enough disruption that the loops lose their grip, and in that gap, something different becomes possible. The fact that symptom reduction correlates with the intensity of ego dissolution is significant. It is not the dose alone that predicts outcome. It is how deeply the filter shifts. Participants who describe the most profound experiences of selflessness, of boundaries dissolving, of ordinary identity temporarily suspending tend to show the greatest long-term improvement. The therapeutic mechanism appears inseparable from the phenomenological one. What psilocybin also does, and this rarely gets enough attention, is make the subjective feel undeniable. Most people carry around frameworks for understanding themselves, inherited from family, culture, education, therapy, religion, whatever shaped them. Those frameworks are often held loosely, believed in theory. Psilocybin has a way of making things felt rather than thought. People do not just intellectually understand that their self-critical patterns came from early experiences. They feel it. They see the connection with a clarity that bypasses argument. That is a different kind of knowing. And it may be precisely why a single session can do what years of traditional talk therapy sometimes cannot. The filter between knowing something and actually integrating it temporarily dissolves. Neuroimaging across multiple trials shows something interesting about what happens after the acute session ends. Some connectivity changes do not simply return to baseline. Particularly, the coupling between the anterior hippocampus and the DMN shows lasting decreases. The brain does not just trip and snap back, it updates. It carries something forward. The baseline itself shifts, at least for a period. That is not what you would expect from a substance that merely creates a temporary altered state. That is what you would expect from an experience that actually changes how the brain organizes itself. A Aztec curandera and an fMRI researcher are using completely different vocabularies. One speaks of spirits and hidden truths. The other speaks of network entropy and weakened priors. But both would agree on the functional outcome. Psilocybin lets you see things about yourself and reality that your ordinary mind was keeping off the table. The shaman calls it revelation. The neuroscientist calls it unconstrained cognition. The person lying in the clinical trial room calls it the most important experience of their life. 3 descriptions. 1 phenomenon. The people who come out of these sessions changed are not reporting that they were given new information. They are reporting that they finally received information they already had. The grief they had not let themselves feel. The pattern they had been refusing to see. The love for other people that their ordinary defended consciousness kept at a careful distance. None of that was absent before the session. It was filtered, filed as too much, too threatening, too destabilizing to let fully through. Filter theories of consciousness now look less like poetry and more like plausible descriptions of a resource-limited brain that must aggressively curate experience to keep you functional. The brain is not showing you everything. It cannot. So it shows you a model, an efficient, survival-optimized model of what is probably out there. Most of the time, that model is accurate enough. Sometimes it becomes rigid, stuck, unable to update. And in those cases, a substance that temporarily loosens the grip of that model can feel like waking up. For every group that has worked with psilocybin across every era, the consistent finding is not chaos. It is recognition, something hidden becoming visible, something that was always there, filtered out for the sake of getting through the day. The ancient Aztec priests, the Mazatec healers, the clinical patients at Johns Hopkins, the imaging studies at Imperial College London, they are all pointing at the same thing from different angles. A single molecule can temporarily show you how much of your mind is being actively withheld from you. Not by an outside force, by your own brain. The question worth sitting with is not what happens when you take psilocybin. The question is what your everyday consciousness is quietly leaving out right now while you are completely certain you are seeing the whole picture.